The first snow of the season fell on the morning they put her out of the palace gates, and it fell on her bare head because no one had thought to give her a bonnet. Wind stood very still on the wrong side of the iron, the side that belonged to the town, and the cold and the long road down to the river, and she did not turn to look back at the windows where she knew they were watching. She had learned in 2 years inside those walls that a woman who looked back was a woman who hoped, and hope was the one thing they could still take from her. So she kept her chin level and her eyes on the white road, and she pressed one gloved hand flat against the front of her plain gray cloak, where beneath the wool and the worn stays and the thin chemise, a secret had begun 3 weeks ago to make itself known to her and to no one else. The guard at the gate would not meet her eyes. He was a young man named Pirip, and he had carried her sewing basket up the east stair more times than either of them could count. And he stood now with the king's order folded in his glove, and his jaw working as though he meant to speak and could not afford to. He gave her instead a single short nod, the only kindness left that would cost him nothing, and she returned it, and that was the whole of her farewell to the place where she had given everything she had. Behind her, high in the north tower, a man watched the snow take her gray shape and make it smaller, and his face did not move at all. The court would say for years afterward that the king had watched the seamstress go without the smallest sign of feeling. The court was wrong about what it saw, as the court so often was. What stood in that window was not coldness. It was a man holding himself so rigidly still that any motion at all might have broken him in front of his entire household, and a king cannot break in a window. Let me tell you how a woman comes to be put out of a palace in the snow, because the answer is never the one the gossips reach for. First, 2 years before that morning, Win Aldercott had walked through the servants' arch at the palace of Brenneholt with a letter of character in her sleeve and 3 needles she had ground sharp herself, and she had been one of 9 new women taken on to dress the linens and mend the court's endless ruin of silk. She was the daughter of a glover, from a market town 3 days' ride to the south, a man who had taught her that a stitch is a promise, that you do not let the world see the seam, and that a thing made honestly will outlast the hand that made it. She was 23 years old that first winter. She had brown hair, the color of a chestnut shell, which she wore in a plain coiled braid, because a needlewoman who wishes to keep her place does not draw the eye, and she had a way of going so quiet over her work that the great ladies forgot she was in the room and said things in front of her they would not have said in front of a mirror. She heard a great deal. In those first 2 years she kept all of it. A glover's daughter knows the value of a closed mouth the way other people know the value of coin. The dismissive label found her early, as such labels always do. It was the mistress of the wardrobe, a hard, tired woman named Mrs. Vane, who fixed it to her in the first month in the close, warm air of the sewing room with its smell of beeswax and pressed linen. A great lady had complained that a hem on her presentation gown sat a half-inch crooked, and Mrs. Pix Vane had taken the gown to the window, found the hem flawless, and said without looking up, low and private, the kind of sentence that is meant to put a girl in her place and keep her there. You are a clever pair of hands and nothing else, and clever hands are bought by the dozen. Do not begin to imagine you are anything more than the thread you pull. Win had bowed her head and said, "Yes, mistress," and gone on with her work. She did not weep. She had decided long before that no one in that house would ever see her weep, and for a very long time no one did. What changed everything was a torn coat and a candle that would not stay lit. It was past midnight in the second autumn of her service, and the king's own valet had come down to the sewing room in a quiet panic because His Majesty had caught the skirt of his dark blue coat on the hinge of a carriage door, returning from a hunt, and there was a council of the northern lords at 9 the next morning. And the coat was the one the king wore when he meant to be obeyed. Every other woman had gone to bed. Win took the coat to the long table, lit a second candle against the first, threaded a needle by feel, and began the slow, invisible work of bringing a 3-inch tear back together, so that no lord across a council table would ever know it had been there. She did not hear him come in. Kings, when they wish, can move like anyone else. He stood in the doorway in his shirt sleeves, which he had never seen, a tall man of 31, with black hair beginning to gray at the temple, and a jaw that the court painters were forever trying and failing to soften, and he watched her hands a long moment before he spoke. "They told me it could not be mended before morning," he said. "We're mistaken, Your Majesty." She did not rise because the coat was in her lap, and rising would have pulled the stitch. She heard, too late, how the words had come out, and added, "Forgive me. I will be finished within the hour." He came and sat down across the table from her, which no king should ever have done, and he watched her work, and he asked her where she had learned it, and she told him about her father and the glove that must not show its seam, and somewhere in that hour, the great machine of rank that stood between them went quiet, the way a clock goes quiet when no one is winding it. He was not, in that room, the man who decided the fates of the northern lords. He was a man who had been alone inside his own life for longer than he could remember, watching two quiet hands make a broken thing whole. This is the part the gossips never tell, because they were not there, and the truth would have spoiled the story they preferred. It did not happen all at once. It happened across a winter, in the small hours, over torn coats that were sometimes genuinely torn and sometimes, she came to suspect, torn on purpose. He learned that she read and brought her books from his own shelf and took them back full of her penciled arguments in the margins. She learned that he carried a grief he never named, a younger brother dead at sea before either of them came of age, and that he kept the brother's compass in his coat and turned it in his fingers when a thing pained him. He told her one night, near the turning of the year, his voice low and level in the way she would later learn, meant he was most in earnest, that he had never in his life spoken to a soul who did not first weigh what he wished to hear. "You weigh only whether it is true," he said. "Do you know how rare that is in a palace?" She did not answer him with words. She had no words that were safe. She answered him by going on being exactly what she was, and he understood her. And for a while, two people who could never be permitted to want each other allowed themselves the smallest, most dangerous thing in the world, which is to be honestly seen. There was a promise. "I will not dress it up for you," because Wynne never dressed up anything. On the last cold night of that winter, in the small chapel off the king's own apartments where the household never came, with no witness but an old chaplain sworn to the king's confidence, Casimir of Brenneholt took the needlewoman by both hands and made her a vow that the law of the realm would have called a marriage if the law had ever been let near it. He gave her a ring too plain to draw a single eye, a thin band of his dead brother's making, and he told her to wear it on a cord beneath her gown until the day he could set it on her hand before the world. He swore that day would come. She believed him, because he had never once lied to her, and because a woman who has been told her whole life that she is only a set of borrowed hands will believe almost anything from the first person who looks at her and sees the rest. She was, in the eyes of the court that did not know, ruined. She did not feel ruined. She felt, for the first time in her life, chosen. The distance between those two words is the whole of this story. Now you must understand the woman who heard the chapel door close that night and decided, with the calm of a person rearranging furniture, that it would not stand. The Dowager Queen Augusta had governed Brenneholt, in all but name, through the long minority of her son, and had never entirely surrendered the habit. She was a handsome, upright woman of 60, with a back like a drawn bowstring, and a mind that filed every face in the court under its precise degree of usefulness. And she had spent 30 years building a marriage alliance with the western kingdom of Marrowford that would bind 2 crowns. The price of that peace was her son's hand, and the bride was already chosen. The Lady Sabine of Marrowford, a clever, lovely, well-schooled young woman, who had been told from the cradle that she would be a queen, and had never once been given cause to doubt it. A glover's daughter, with a ring on a cord, was not a scandal to the Dowager Queen. She was a fault line under a treaty, and the Dowager Queen did not tolerate fault lines. She did not move at once. That was her genius, and Wynne, who underestimated almost no one, underestimated her. The Dowager Queen watched through the spring and into the summer, and she had the chaplain quietly pensioned to a far northern living with the roads closed for half the year. And she had a clerk she trusted begin, very slowly, to remove from the household's papers any account of certain late candles in the sewing room. She built her case the way a patient mason builds a wall. And, when she struck at last, in the first hard week of the following autumn, she struck with a wall already standing. What she did was this, and the cruelty of it was that almost every brick was true. She let it be known, through 3 mouths, in 3 days, that the king's seamstress had been seen leaving the king's apartments in the small hours. That much had happened. She produced a letter, in a hand very like Wyn's own, in which the seamstress appeared to boast to a sister in the south of having got the king's promise and meaning to hold him to a crown. Wyn had no sister in the south and had written no such letter, but the letter existed, on real paper in convincing ink, and a letter you can hold in your hand outweighs a denial you cannot. And then the Dowager Queen did the thing that turned a scandal into a banishment. She went to her son alone, and she told him that the woman he had let see him whole had been a placed agent of the western faction that opposed the Merrowford peace, that the chapel vow had been a trap to make him refuse the alliance and plunge the border back into war, and that the proof was in the seamstress's own hand. A waiting woman carried the Dowager Queen's verdict down through the household within the hour, and it reached Wyn in the sewing room from a kitchen maid's frightened lips, repeated word for word as a thing too dreadful not to pass along. The girl said Her Majesty had named the seamstress nothing but a needle that had presumed to reach for a crown, and that a pair of bought hands always overreached in the end, and that the king had wept to learn how he had been used. Wyn had set down her needle and said nothing, because she understood already that the verdict had been spoken before the trial, and that the trial would change nothing. Casimir read the letter. He read it as a man reads a thing he cannot bear to be true, looking for the seam, finding what he had been built to find. He did not know that the chaplain had been sent away. He did not know that the marriage record had been lifted from the chapel book. He knew only that he had broken every rule of his rank for a needlewoman with no name in the world, and that here in ink was the cost of it, and that he was a king and could not afford to have been a fool. The thing that broke in him then broke quietly, and he never let his mother see it. He sent for Wyn the next morning. He did not let her speak. A man who fears he will believe her cannot afford to hear her voice, and the Dowager Queen had counted on exactly that. He stood at the cold end of the council chamber with the forged letter on the table between them and said, in the level voice she had once thought she understood, that her service was ended, that she would be gone by the next morning, and that she was never to come within the walls of Brennaholt again. He did not call her by her name. That was how she knew the wound went all the way through him, though she did not understand the wound's true shape until much later. He could not say Wyn. He said you, and he kept saying you, and each one fell like a small, cold stone. She did not weep. She had promised herself 2 years before that no one in that house would see her weep, and she kept the promise on the worst morning of her life. She looked at the letter she had not written, and she looked at the man she had married in a chapel by candlelight, and she understood 2 things at once with terrible clarity, that someone had built this, and that he did not know it had been built. She said only one thing before they led her out. She said, I have never in my life made a seam to hide a lie. Look for who taught your hand to read this one. Then she went, and the snow came down, and Pirrip gave her his single nod, and the gates closed. And that, the court agreed, was the end of the seamstress who had reached too high. What she carried out through the gates none of them knew. 2 things. Beneath her cloak, on its cord, the thin plain ring of a dead man's making, and beneath that not yet showing, the child she had not yet found the moment to tell him of, conceived in the last week before the wall came down, an heir to the crown of Brennaholt riding south in the snow, inside a banished woman who owned nothing in the world but her hands. The road took her to the river town of Lofert, where the mail coaches changed horses, and a woman who could sew could keep from starving. And there, above a chandler's shop in a narrow street that smelled of tallow and the wet stone of the quay, Win Aldercott made herself a life out of the only thing the palace had not been able to take. She did not go home to her father's market town. She could not have borne the questions, and more than that, she would not bring what she now suspected she carried into a house, where her father would have had to spend the rest of his days defending her honor with his fists. She wrote him a single careful letter saying only that she had taken a post in Loford with a respectable mantua maker, and she sent it, and she set her face toward the work in front of her and did not let herself look back, because she had learned that lesson at a closed gate in the snow. The mantua maker was a sharp-eyed widow named Mrs. Tarrant, who paid little and watched everything, and within a season she had stopped watching Win, because Win's hands had brought 3 of Loford's better families through her door, and Mrs. Tarrant was not a fool. Win let the town believe she was a young widow. It cost her nothing, and it kept the worst of the talk away from the child, and when the child came, laid in the hard frost of that first winter alone, in the low room above the chandler's, with a midwife and a single tallow candle, Win held her son and understood that the world had narrowed to one thing she would defend with her life: leave undefended in the snow. She named him Tobias, for no one, because she would give him a name that owed nothing to anybody and could never be used against him. She told the town his father had been a soldier, lost on the northern roads. She put the dead man's ring back on its cord and tucked it away, and she did not take it out, and she did not let herself grieve it, because Tobias needed her hands steady and her eyes clear, and a woman with a child to feed cannot afford to grieve a man who put her out in the snow. Still, she kept the forged letters lesson. She had set it at the door. Look for who taught your hand to read this one. In the long evenings after Tobias slept, by the light of one candle to save the second, Win went back over the 2 years stitch by stitch in her memory, the way she went back over a seam that had failed to find the one weak place. And the more she looked, the more clearly she saw the shape of the hand that had done it. The chaplain gone, the papers thinned, the letter in a hand like hers but not hers, made by someone who had seen her writing and studied it. Only one person in that household had the patience, the reach, and the reason. And Win began very quietly to gather what a banished seamstress could gather, which was less than nothing, until the day a hard-riding northern winter and a closed road delivered into her hands the one thing the Dowager Queen had been too thorough to imagine could ever come back. The chaplain came to Loford to die. He was an old man by then, Father Reed, half-blind and racked with the cough that the far northern damp had set into his chest, and he had been sent south in a last mercy to a brother house near the coast, and the road through Loford was where his strength gave out. They carried him into the chandler's lower room, because it was the nearest fire, and Mrs. Tarrant sent up for Win, because Win was good with the dying, and Win came down the stair with a bowl of broth and stopped on the bottom step, because she knew the ruined face by the fire, and the ruined face, after a long, terrible moment, knew hers. "I married you," the old man whispered, when the room had emptied and only the 2 of them and the firelight remained. "God forgive me. I married you to him, and I let them carry me off, and I have prayed every night of 3 years that I would die before I had to answer for it." He gripped her wrist with a hand like a bundle of dry sticks. "The book," he said. "They took the book, but they did not take the leaf. I tore it out before they came. I have carried it sewn into the lining of my breviary for 3 years, because I did not dare to burn it, and did not dare to send it." He looked at her with his blind eyes streaming. "It has your name and his and the day and my own hand beneath. It is a true record of a true marriage. Take it. I am too old to be brave, and you were always braver." Then the whole of that court, she took the breviary from his shaking hands. She opened the back lining with a seamstress's small knife, the way she had opened 100 hymns, and there, inside, browned and soft with 3 years against an old man's heart, was a single torn leaf in a careful clerical hand, and on it her name, and the king's, and the date of the last cold night of that long-ago winter, and beneath it the witnessing signature of the man who lay dying by her fire. She held it, and her hands, which had not shaken at the gates in the snow, shook. Now Father Reed died before the frost broke. Win buried him with her own small savings, and sat the night beside him. And in the gray before dawn, she made the decision that would carry her north again, and she made it not for herself. She made it for a sharp, grave, watchful little boy of 2, with his father's black hair, and his father's level way of looking at a thing as though weighing whether it was true. A boy who deserved to know that he had not been born of a soldier's lie in a tallow-smelling room, but of a true vow in a candle-lit chapel, and who deserved never to be told that his mother had no answer for the world. She did not go north to reclaim a king. She had no wish left for the man in the window. She went north to put one true leaf of paper on a table in front of the woman who had taught a forger's hand to lie, and to say, before witnesses, here is the seam you could not hide. This is the part where I will ask you, if Win's courage has held you this far, to stay until the end, because what she carried north deserves to be witnessed and not merely heard about. Then I will tell you what happened when a banished seamstress walked back through the iron she had been put out of, 3 years to the season, with a torn leaf of paper and a small boy's hand in hers. The occasion she chose was not chosen lightly. The Dowager Queen's long work had at last come to its harvest. The betrothal of King Casimir to the Lady Sabine of Meroford was to be sealed before the whole court in the great hall of Brenneholt, on the feast that closed the autumn, with the treaty laid open on the high table and the 2 kingdoms' lords as witnesses. It was Win understood the precise moment when the Dowager Queen's wall stood highest and looked most finished. It was therefore the precise moment to show the court a single brick that did not belong. She came to Brenneholt 3 days before the feast, and she did not come as a beggar at the gate. She came as Mrs. Tarrant's most trusted hand, for Tarrant's reputation had spread north along the coaching road, and a hall preparing for a royal betrothal needs every skilled needlewoman it can hire, and no one looks twice at a sober widow in gray who has come to let out 100 yards of seam before a feast. Pirip was a sergeant of the gate, now older, steadier, and when the gray-cloaked woman came through with the seamstress's cart and lifted her face to him for one instant, his hand tightened on his halberd, and his jaw worked exactly as it had worked 3 years before, and he said nothing. And that was the second kindness he gave her that cost him everything and nothing. Tobias, she left with Mrs. Tarrant in the town below, because whatever happened in that hall, the child would not stand inside the reach of the woman who had put his mother in the snow. For 3 days Win sewed in the lower rooms of the palace. She had been forbidden, and she watched and she listened, the way she had once listened over the great lady's hems, and the palace told her everything she needed, because the palace had never learned to see her. She learned that the Lady Sabine was no fool and no monster, only a young woman who had been promised a throne and was beginning, in the careful way of clever people, to notice that her bridegroom looked at the treaty as a man looks at a sentence handed down. She learned that the king had not laughed in 3 years. She learned from a maid who did not know who she spoke to that His Majesty kept to the North Tower and turned a small brass compass in his fingers at the council table when a thing pained him, and that no one knew why. And she learned where the Dowager Queen kept the forger. For the wall had a flaw, as walls built in haste over true ground always do. The clerk who had thinned the papers and the hand that had aged Win's writing into a lie were the same man, a soft, frightened, clever creature named Mr. By Quill, who had risen high in the Dowager Queen's service on the strength of doing exactly such work and asking nothing, and Mr. Quill, 3 years on and grown fat on the Dowager Queen's coin, had begun to be afraid. A man who has forged a banishment lies awake, wondering what becomes of him when the woman he wronged is dead and can no longer answer for the lie, and what becomes of him when she is not. Win did not threaten him. She did better. She let him see her, once, across the lower passage, gray-cloaked and calm and alive. And she let his own 3 years of fear do the rest. And on the second night, Mr. Quill came to her of his own accord with his hands shaking and his confession ready, because the Dowager Queen had taught him too well that the safest place to stand is beside the one who is about to win. She did not trust him. A man who forges once forges twice. She did not need to trust him, though. She needed only the second true thing to set beside the first, and Mr. Cumper Quill brought it, the original draft of the forged letter, in his own hand, with the Dowager Queen's corrections in the margin, in the Dowager Queen's own unmistakable pen. The wall's foundation stone with the mason's name carved in it. Wynne sewed it that night into the lining of her own gray bodice, beside the torn leaf of the marriage book the way Father Reed had carried his secret against his heart. And she dressed the next morning to go into the great hall, and her hands did not shake at all. The hall of Brenneholt under 1,000 candles was the most beautiful thing in the kingdom and the cruelest. And Wynne stood at its edge among the household servants in her gray, and she watched the court she had been cast out of arrange itself in its degrees. The Dowager Queen sat near the high table in dove-gray silk and the old Queen's diamonds, her back like a drawn bowstring, her cold, clever eyes moving over the hall and filing every face, and they passed over the gray seamstress at the wall without a flicker, because the Dowager Queen had long ago decided that the seamstress was a closed account. The Lady Sabine sat in white and silver, lovely and composed and watchful, and the king came in last, in the dark blue coat, with the invisible seam that a banished woman had mended in the small hours of a winter. 3 years gone, and he took his place, and he did not smile. And at one moment, when the herald began to read the terms of the treaty aloud, his right hand went to his coat and took out a small brass compass and turned it once, slowly, between his fingers. Wynne saw it. Across the whole length of that blazing hall, she saw the man she had married turn his dead brother's compass in his hand, because something pained him, and for the first time in 3 years, the wish she had buried in the snow stirred under the frost, and she put her own hand flat against her gray bodice where 2 true things were sewn, and she waited. The herald reached the place in the treaty where the king's free and unmarried hand was named, and Wynne Aldercott stepped out from the wall. She did not run. She did not cry out. A woman who has crossed a kingdom on foot does not spoil the arrival by hurrying. She walked into the open floor of the great hall in her plain gray between the high table and the staring lords, into the one place in the world she had been forbidden to stand, and the hall went silent the way a room goes silent when a clock that has ticked for years suddenly stops. The Dowager Queen's eyes found her, and for one instant that Wynne would keep for the rest of her life, that perfect upright back went rigid with the recognition of a brick she had been certain was buried. "Your Majesty," Wynne said into the silence, her voice level and carrying, and entirely without fear, "before the herald names you a free man, the law of this realm requires that you hear a thing that was hidden from you 3 years ago." The king had come to his feet. His face had gone the color of the snow she had walked out into, and his hand had closed white around the compass, and he said in a voice she had heard only once before, on the worst morning of her life, "You are forbidden these walls." Beneath the order, though she heard the thing the court could not hear, which was a man holding himself rigidly still so that he would not break in front of his entire household, and she answered the man, and not the king. "I was forbidden them," she said, "by a letter I did not write." She drew the torn leaf from her bodice and laid it on the white cloth of the high table in front of him, browned and soft and true. "This is the leaf torn from your own chapel book, in the hand of Father Red, who married us by candlelight on the last night of a winter you have not let yourself remember, and who carried this against his heart for 3 years and gave it to me with his dying breath. It bears your name and mine, and the day. I did not come to claim a crown. I came so that this court would know I never lied, and so that one other person would one day be able to read it." A sound went through the hall like wind through standing corn. The Dowager Queen rose. She was magnificent in her ruin, and she did not concede an inch. And this is where you must understand that she was no fool, collapsing at a touch, but a builder defending a wall she had given 30 years to raise. "A forgery," she said, clear and cold and certain. And she did not look at the leaf, she looked at the hall, because she knew, as Win knew, that a court believes the one who seems least afraid. A dead priest scrap, written by this woman's own clever hands, which we all know are clever. She forged a boast 3 years ago to entrap a king. She forges a marriage now to do the same. I had the truth of her then, and the realm has the truth of her now. Remove her." The guards came forward, and the whole of 3 years turned on the next thing Win did, and she had planned it stitch by stitch, because she had known the Dowager Queen would call the true thing a forgery, having taught the court so well to believe in forgeries. "You say my hands are clever," Win said, and she did not raise her voice. And the guards, hearing something in it, slowed. "You have said it for 5 years. You said it the first month I came, through Mrs. Nom. Vain that I was a clever pair of hands and nothing else. You built everything you did to me upon it. So let the court ask the only question that matters. Who was clever enough to age my writing into a letter I never wrote?" She turned, not to the king and not to the Dowager Queen, but to the soft, fat, frightened man who had been standing at the Dowager Queen's shoulder going grayer by the moment, and she said gently, almost kindly, "Mr. Quill, you corrected the draft last night by my candle. Will you tell them, or shall I show them the margin in Her Majesty's own pen?" Mr. Bull. Quill broke as forgers break, all at once and completely, and went down on his knees on the floor of the great hall and told it. The thinned papers, the pensioned chaplain, the studied hand, the letter built brick by brick at the Dowager Queen's instruction to make a fault line look like a treason, and Win drew the second leaf from her bodice. The original draft with the Dowager Queen's corrections marching down the margin in the Dowager Queen's own unmistakable pen, and she laid it on the white cloth beside the first, 2 true things side by side, the seam at last turned inside out for the whole court to read. The Dowager Queen did not weep and did not plead. She looked at the 2 papers on the white cloth, and then she looked at her son, and for the length of one breath, the cold, clever certainty went out of her face, and something older and more tired came into it, the face of a woman who has spent 30 years building a peace, and discovers in front of the world that she built it on a lie and that her son knows. "I did it for the realm," she said, and her voice, for the first time in anyone's memory, fragmented on the last word. "I did it for the peace. You would have thrown a treaty to the wind for a glover's daughter." "I would have done it honestly," the king said. They were the first words he had spoken since the leaf had touched the table, and they were quiet, and they were level, and they fell in that silent hall with the weight of 3 years behind them. He did not rage at his mother. He did not order her dragged out, or stripped, or shamed, beyond the shaming she had already laid upon herself, in front of every lord of 2 kingdoms. He looked at her for a long moment, and what passed over his face was not triumph. It was grief, for the years, and for the woman she had been before the order she protected had hollowed her out. "You will withdraw to the dower house at Marrowford," he said, "and you will see the peace you wanted made. For the Lady Sabine deserves a throne, and shall have one that is not mine. Yet you will not stand in my hall again, and you will not, while I live, be within reach of my son." The Dowager Queen's head came up at that last word. So did the whole hall's. And the king turned away from his mother, and he came down from the high table, and he crossed the open floor of the great hall of Brenneholt to where a woman in plain grey stood between the staring lords. Exactly as he had once crossed a sewing room to sit at a long table he had no business sitting at, the way he had stopped only once before, and the whole court held its breath. He did not make a speech. The man had never in his life made a speech to her, and he did not begin now. He looked at her face as though he were learning again how to read the only true page in his kingdom, and his composure, which had held in a window through a snowfall 3 years before, came apart at last where his entire household could see it, and he did not care. "Win," he said. It was the first time he had spoken her name in 3 years. He had not been able to say it on the worst morning of her life, and the court had thought that coldness, and it had never been coldness. It had been a wound, and the wound spoke now. He took her hand, the right hand, the one the whole court had been taught to fear, And he turned it over and looked at it, and then he reached into his coat, passed the compass, and drew out a thin, plain band of his dead brother's making that he had carried against his own heart for 3 years. To look at it, the mate to the ring she still wore on its cord beneath her grey, and he set it where it belonged. "Before this hall," he said, his voice level and carrying and entirely without fear, in the same arena where another verdict had once been handed down. "This is my wife, and she has always been my wife, and the wrong done to her was done in my name and will be undone in my name." 11 words of vow and a sentence of justice, and not one word more. Because the man who issued commands that were truly protection did not need more, and he had learned long ago in a candlelit room that she weighed not the quantity of a thing but whether it was true. She did not weep even then. She had promised herself at a closed gate that no one in that house would see her weep, and she kept the promise to the last, because she was Win Aldercott, and a thing she decided, stayed decided. She put her free hand flat against his chest where the compass lay the way she had put it against her own grey bodice through 3 years of waiting, and she said the only thing she had come north to be able to say, which was not for him, and not for the court, but for a small, grave boy in a town below the walls. She said, "There is someone you have never met. He has your hair, and your way of looking at a thing to weigh whether it is true. And I named him for no one, so that the name would owe nothing to anybody, and could never be used against him. His name is Tobias, and he is yours. And he was riding south inside me through the snow on the morning you could not say my name. For a moment the King of Brenneholt could not speak at all. His hand tightened on hers until it nearly hurt, and the brass compass pressed cold between her palm and his heart. And the man who had been alone inside his own life for longer than he could remember stood in the center of his blazing hall and understood that he had put his wife and his unborn son out into the snow on the word of a forged letter, and that they had both survived it, and that the surviving had been done by the clever hands the whole court had been taught to despise. When he could speak, he said only, "Bring him home." And the way he said it was not a command, though it had the shape of one. It was a man asking to be allowed back into the only thing he had ever made that mattered. And Win, who had spent 5 years being told she was only a pair of hands, looked at the king on his knees in everything but posture, and gave him the one answer that was true. "He has been wanting to know," she said, "where his father's compass points." They were married again 3 weeks later, in the great chapel this time, and not the small one, before the whole court and both kingdoms' lords. And the Lady Sabine of Marrowford stood among the witnesses, in white and silver, and was, by every account, the first to come forward afterward and take the new queen's hand in both of hers. For she was a clever woman herself, and clever women know a true seam when they are shown one, and the peace was made in the end without the lie beneath it, which is the only kind of peace that holds. The Dowager Queen withdrew to the dower house at Marrowford, and was not seen again in the hall of Brenneholt, and word came north, in the second spring, that she had asked once, through a letter, whether the boy was well, and that the new queen had written back a single line in her own steady hand, that he was well, and that he had her own way of weighing whether a thing was true, and that he would be told when he was old enough to understand it, that his grandmother had built a peace, even if she had built it the wrong way. Mercy, Win had decided, was a finer seam than vengeance, and harder to sew, and worth more. Mr. Ballader. Quill was sent south to a clerkship in a country town where the worst he could forge was a tradesman's bill, and Pirrip was made captain of the king's own gate, and old Mrs. Mann. Vane, who had told a frightened girl she was a clever pair of hands and nothing else, lived long enough to dress the queen's presentation gown, and to find that the queen, who could have turned her out, kept her on, because Win forgot nothing and forgave the small things, which is the rarer mercy. On a winter evening the following year, in the warm wooden firelight of the king's own apartments, the snow came down again outside the north tower window, the same window from which a man had once watched a grey shape grow smaller in the white, and had not let himself break. He stood at the glass now with the window open, a hand's width to the cold, and he was not alone, and he was not still in the terrible rigid way of 3 years before. A grave, dark-haired boy of 3 sat on the floor by the fire turning a small brass compass in his fingers, weighing it, frowning at it the way his father frowned at a treaty, asking it which way was north. And a woman in a warm green gown, with a thin plain ring on her hand at last, and another on a cord beneath, no longer needed, kept now only because a thing made honestly outlasts the hand that made it, sat near the fire with a needle and a torn coat in her lap. Because the king still caught his coats on hinges, and there was still no one in the kingdom who could mend a seam so that no lord would ever know it had been there. She did not look up from her work when he crossed the room to her. She had learned, long ago, that a woman who keeps her eyes on the seam is a woman the world forgets is in the room, and there was nothing left in this room she needed to forget her, and everything left in it she meant to keep. He sat down beside her the way he had no business doing and had always done anyway, and he watched her hands bring the torn blue wool back together, stitch by invisible stitch, and across the firelight their son asked the compass once more which way was north, and the snow fell soft and gold-lit past the open window onto the world below, and inside, where it was warm, 3 people who had been put out into the cold, and had walked all the way back, were at very long last, exactly where they belonged. If Wind's journey moved you, stay a moment in the warmth of that room before you go, and remember that the world's first verdict on a woman is so very rarely its last.